All right. Hey, good to see everybody. So this past week, hope you guys recovered a little bit. We wanted to give you guys a little bit of break, so we gave you guys Friday off. But then you guys went to the beach. Then I was like, shoot, TFTI, man. The staff, we just had a work night because we were kind of behind on some things and stuff like that. So anyway, I'm glad you guys went. Hopefully nobody got hurt. So cool. All right. So I want to show some pictures. Let's show some pictures. So. So, weddings are incredibly beautiful, very powerful. It's one of the few things that can make me consistently tear up because the power of that union, your words, binding you together forever is just a powerful thing, right? Funerals are powerful too, in a different way. I don't know, how many of you guys have been to a funeral before? Oh, almost everybody, okay. I thought you guys were too young maybe, but I remember the first funeral I went to, I was about 6 or 7. It was kind of a blur though, because it was for my grandfather, whom I didn't know almost at all. All I remember was I was sitting on the stairs and a lot of people were crying and the coffin. That's sort of all I remember from that time. Ecclesiastes 7:2 says this, "It is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting." So a lot of commentators kind of shorthand this to say it's better to go to a funeral than to a wedding. For this is the end of all mankind, and the living will lay it to heart. Why is it better to go to a funeral than a wedding? Because you will start to think about the sinking ship, right? And then you will lay it to heart. You're still living, and you can change the way that you live. You can lay it to heart. Today's text in Luke is about a funeral. And at least that's how it starts. And it's one of the only few funerals in history that got canceled by Jesus. Okay, so let's read our text today. So Luke 7:11-17. Soon afterwards, he went to a town called Nain. And his disciples and a great crowd went with him. As he drew near to the gate of the town, behold, a man who had died was being carried out. So it's sort of in the middle of a funeral, right? The only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and a considerable crowd from the town was with her. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said to her, "Do not weep." Then he came up to her and touched the bier, and the bearer stood still. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." And the dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. Fear seized them all, and they glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has risen among us, and God has visited his people." And this report about him spread throughout the whole of Judea and all the surrounding country. So it's a really amazing story, what happens here, but sorry, just a little aside on miracles. It's like the way that, because what happens here is basically Jesus raises someone from the dead, right? But the way that Luke talks about it is very underwhelming. It's sort of like, yeah, they went here and there was a crowd and then he did this and he said, "Oh, get up," and then they went home. It's sort of like that. So this pattern of just straightforward telling the miracle as it is consistent with the Gospels, right? The Gospels regularly talk about miracles this way, including the greatest miracle of all, which is the resurrection of Jesus, right? So. So for I know some of you there's a certain kind of way of thinking, which is to say that okay, this is just impossible. Christianity is just impossible because miracles. But I just if that's you, I just want to appeal to you to actually look into the evidence for the resurrection. Okay, because that evidence is so solid, it has actually turned a lot of staunch atheists into theists. Even the enemies of Christianity at the time, they didn't deny that Jesus did miracles. They just said that he did it through demonic power. Okay, so I think that's just something. Okay, so let's move on. All right, so verse 11. Soon afterward, he went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a great crowd went with him. Okay, so there's a great crowd walking along with Jesus, and they get to this town called Nain. Why is there a great crowd with him? Well, it says soon afterwards. The story that comes right before this is the story of the centurion, the Roman centurion, comes to Jesus and asks him to heal his servant who is on the verge of death. And Jesus says, like, as they're kind of talking, the Roman centurion then says, hey, I don't even deserve to have you come into my house. And you have so much power that you could just say a word and heal him. And Jesus praises him for his faith. Only 2 people in the Bible does Jesus praise for their faith. Both of them are Gentile, non-Jewish, right? How could this Roman centurion, the oppressors, and someone in authority leading 100 soldiers or so, come to Jesus and call him Lord and then ask him to heal his servant, right? Like, that's amazing what he does. And so Jesus, with the word, doesn't even go to him, heals him, okay? So you can imagine the buzz, right? Like when Jesus heals people, like, so there's a great crowd of people. They're like, Jesus is walking, they're all following him, like, oh my God, like it must be crazy. Like they're like, dude, you see what happened? Like, oh my gosh, and slapping each other's backs, and like, oh, dude, we're gonna march on Rome or whatever. Like this, there's energy coming from this crowd. They're getting to Nain. And what do they meet? As they drew near to the gate of the town, behold, a man who had died was being carried out, the only son of his mother. She was a widow, and a considerable crowd from the town was with her. So you have the crowd with Jesus coming, and then you have this other crowd coming out of the town. And these 2 crowds, they meet at the gate of the city. One crowd is full of energy and victory. The other is quite different, right? I'd imagine that the crowd that was with Jesus, like once they figured out what was going on, as they see the other crowd coming, probably the mood takes a turn. Because the other crowd is likely pretty somber, maybe a lot of crying and wailing. Suddenly a hush on the crowd that's with Jesus, right? So sort of like, I don't know if you've ever had this experience before, but you're sort of driving with your friends, and like there's a traffic jam. You're like, oh, this is so annoying, and then you get to the choke point, and then you because everybody rubbernecks, right? That's why there's traffic, right? So, but you're like, oh, I can't believe all these people who are rubbernecking, but then when it's you, like you rubberneck, right? And then you look over and there's like 3 cars mangled, and one is upside down, and there's like an ambulance. And whatever you were talking about in the car, suddenly like nobody's talking, right? There's a hush because you know that somebody got really hurt. In the text, it focuses on this widow. Not only did she lose her husband, she lost her son and her only son. And like added to that, not only is that itself incredibly sad, but in that society, patriarchal society, like it's hard to earn money as a woman because you have to rely on your husband. Once your husband is gone, you have to rely on your sons. Now her only son is gone. Also in that time, funerals happened a few hours, usually within 8 hours of the death itself, because the heat would do some damage to the body. And so you can imagine this woman and what she's feeling. Probably still in shock. Death is always sobering. It's always sad. But there are few things sadder than a parent having to bury their child. When you go to a funeral, like you'll often see pictures of them when they were young. Sometimes you'll see a slideshow. And you realize that they've had a very full life. They used to be young once, and they had a lot of relationships. So, pictures, what do they show? Like, they don't show their degrees, like they show relationships, right? They show people, they show family, they show friends. And then you sort of look at the coffin and you look at the family members weeping uncontrollably. And there's a feeling like this is wrong. This is not the way that it should be. There's something there between the family members. There's love between the family members. and death got in the way. Death took that away. You know, the Bible's description of death is really interesting because it doesn't say like, oh, you should just accept reality. It doesn't say, you know, life is a circle, like deal with it. Actually, the Bible calls death the last enemy, the last enemy. It's just interesting. It's an interesting description because actually death is the most natural thing in the world, right? Like everything that is alive will grow old and die. Everything. Plants, animals, humans. Like we know this. There is no exception to this rule. Ben Franklin said, nothing is certain in life except death and taxes. Although we know from the rich people in this country, sometimes they can avoid this. But they can't avoid this, right? George Bernard Shaw said, death is the ultimate statistic. 1 out of 1. Death is powerful. It's indifferent. Doesn't matter if you're a king or a peasant. Doesn't matter if you're a billionaire or if you're homeless. Death comes from everybody is the ultimate statistic, 1 for 1. And so you would think then that this means that we should make peace with death because it is so natural, it will happen to everyone. But that's not at all how we experience it. We don't experience death as natural. We experience it as incredibly disruptive. We experience it as our souls being ripped from us. I had office hours with someone a week ago because they needed help just dealing with loss. One of their mentors passed away a few months ago, and he was sort of dealing with that. And then one of his friends, same age, he's a freshman, but one of his friends suddenly passed away, cardiac arrest. How do you deal with that? You know? Like, here's what not to say. Don't say, hey, man, death is the ultimate statistic, man. You should just accept it. Like, don't say that, right? Because it feels wrong. Death is natural, but it feels really wrong. We don't experience death of the people that we care about this way. A few weeks ago, I met up with one of my really good college friends. We did so many stupid things together in college, and we were roommates for some time. And he was part of our church for a little while, and then him and his wife moved on. But you know, we still keep in touch. We get to see each other every so often. And then got a text suddenly that he was in the ER from a heart attack, and so after a few weeks of recovery, went to go visit him, see how he was doing. He was doing okay, but he kind of told me the story of what happened. It was totally unexpected. He woke up in the middle of the night, just some chest pain, and he's like, "Oh, this is weird." And he took some, like Tums or whatever, antacid, and he just went back to sleep. But kept waking up throughout the night with chest pain, and finally decided, okay, it was like 4 a.m. He's like, finally decided I should probably go to the ER. He went to the ER. He was having a heart attack. He was very, very close. He had to get an immediate triple bypass surgery, and that's how he survived. And this is a guy that I used to live with. Here's someone that's my age, and like I had this distinct feeling as we were kind of hanging out. Like this day could have been your funeral. I was so thankful that we got to meet up, and I was just thinking about our friendship. I was thinking about his wife and 2 kids. And death is natural, but we don't experience it that way. Like we all know what's going to happen, but when it's the person that you love, it feels like they're being ripped away from you, right? Death feels like an enemy that you cannot defeat. And so the Bible, it gives voice to that sense that death is the enemy. It's not natural. It's not right. It's not right. Why? Because love demands an eternity. At what point is it okay for that love to be interrupted? Never. Never. Even your grandparents, whom, many of you have really good relationship with your grandparents, like even at 80, 90, 100, still you will feel that sense of loss. And so the mother in this story, like, it's tragic and it's sad, and we can all feel for her because either we've experienced that before or we know that we will, right? This crowd that's coming out of Nain, the city of Nain, it's a profound snapshot of humanity. A funeral procession on its way to the grave. It's a little bit morbid, but that's an accurate picture of life. We are all on that procession. We are all on our way to the grave. Death is the ultimate statistic. There are no exceptions. So what do we do with that? What do we do with that uncomfortable reality? I've known people who, after the death of someone they love, they just become numb. They distract themselves. They binge watch something. Pascal said, we run heedlessly into the abyss after putting something in front of us to stop us from seeing it, right? Like it's uncomfortable, so we don't want to see it, so we just blind ourselves. Some people, they seize up with fear and anxiety and drivenness. So Hebrews 2:15, it says that the fear of death has subjected us to lifelong slavery. Fear of death has subjected us to lifelong slavery. So much of our fear and anxiety and drivenness to succeed, this impatience to succeed, comes from the fact that we know that we don't have forever. What if you live forever? Like, you could take your time doing everything. Like, you could take 100 years to decide your major. Like, let me try this one out. Like, I don't know about it. All right, well, let me try this one out. Like, you could take forever. Like, you could take another 100 years to find the perfect husband or wife for you, But you kind of know you don't have that time. Time is ticking. Freshmen, they come in and they think they have all the time in the world, and exploring, meeting new friends. The world is your oyster. And then sophomores are different. Sophomores are not carefree. Suffering sophomores. They need to declare soon. They need to make sure they get their classes, right? Your enrollment window is super important. Like, sorry, freshmen, you guys are going to be sophomores very soon. Juniors, they usually start relaxing about their GPA because they can't change it that much anyway. So there's a release that happens, but the stress now becomes internships, right? Internships and tests. Like, you got the GREs coming up. If you're thinking about grad school, you got to take your GREs. You got to take your MCATs. You got to take your LSATs. You got to take your DATs. You got to, all of that. And that becomes a stress. And of course, the seniors, interviews, job search, existential question of life. It's going to happen to me after I graduate. And there's this closing window of time always gnawing at you. And so you have this procession, people on their way to the grave. And there's another procession led by Jesus and his disciples. They're on a collision course, and then Jesus meets this widow. What happens? He saw her, and he had compassion on her. This is the consistent description of God in the Bible, that he sees and he has compassion. It's very different from the picture of God, I think, that we often have when we lose a loved one, because I think sometimes the natural reaction is to say, God, why? Where were you? We feel like God's not there. We feel like God's aloof. But in this story, Jesus saw her and had compassion on her. Compassion, it's kind of a compound word, come and passion. Passion means suffering, right? Passion of the Christ. Passion week, that's suffering. Suffering of the Christ, the suffering week. Passion. Come is with, right? So compassion means to suffer with. And that's again the story of Jesus. When he sees, he suffers with. And then he says something that you should never ever say at a funeral ever. Stop crying, man. Do not weep. He meets this widow and he sees her, he has compassion on her, and he says, do not weep. How can he say that? Well, he can say that because of what happens next. Then he came up and touched the bier, and the bearer stood still, and he said this, young man, I say to you, arise. And the dead man sat up and began to speak. God, whose voice in Genesis 1 made all of creation, right? He says, let there be, and it was so. That same voice that told the storm to calm down, right? Be still, be muzzled, and nature listens to this voice. That same voice Jesus uses to say, young man, arise. And so it happens. Why is he able to say this? Well, because he's able to also say this. What is the people's response? Fear. Fear sees them all. It's not they were like, yo, this is amazing. This is all. I mean, of course, there was some of that too, but it's fear. Now, biblical fear is not just like I'm afraid, but in the Bible, fear also means reverence. Like, whoa, did you all just see what happened there? Fear sees them all, and they glorified God, saying a great prophet has arisen among us, and God has visited his people, right? Compassion. God has visited his people. And this report about him spread throughout the whole of Judea and all the surrounding country. This story started with sorrow, despair, and hopelessness, but it ends with hope and rejoicing. And it's the gospel in a nutshell. Because death was never part of God's original plan. It was never part of God's original plan. That's why we're so maladjusted to it. That's why it doesn't feel natural, because it was never part of the plan. God created us to be with him in eternal relationship, to be connected to each other because love demands an eternity. But it's our sin that cuts us off from God, cuts us off from the source of eternal life. And that's when death enters in, the last enemy, the greatest enemy. And so Jesus, he sees us in our sin and he has compassion for us. He suffers with us. You know, we talked about a couple weeks ago, Jesus, he's on his way to Jerusalem, right? Why is he on his way to Jerusalem? It's to die on the cross. And so Jesus doesn't just leave us alone in our sin. He enters into our world. He suffers along with us. And then he ultimately goes to the cross. And on the cross, he was tortured and he died. Why? It's not for anything that he did. He was perfect and sinless. He did it for us. He did it for you and for me. He did it to make a way for us to rise. So at the end of the day, this first death, this bodily death, comes to us all, but it's not that important. What ends up being more important is what happens to us after this. And this is what Jesus came to solve. Our ultimate relationship with God forever. So in this story, there are two processions, right? Two processions. There's a procession that goes towards death, and there's a procession towards life through Jesus. And those two processions meet and have a collision course. And when they meet, Jesus wins. Jesus swallows up death. And so I guess I want to ask you, sort of as we wrap up, I want to ask you, what procession are you in? What procession are you in? Everyone starts on the procession towards death. There is no other option. It is the ultimate statistic. Everyone is on their way there. Everyone and everyone you love. You start on that procession. But there's another force that comes. Another procession, a procession that leads to life. And the only one who can change that ultimate destiny is the author of life himself. So, what procession are you in? If you're on the procession towards death, or you're not quite sure, I would just urge you to make that clear. Acknowledge your sin so that you can have a saving relationship with God. And remember, being in the procession of life with Jesus is not just an intellectual exercise, right? To be in the procession with Jesus means you're walking with him. It means that you're following him. It means that with your body and your actions, you're actually doing what he's calling us to do, to go where Jesus is going. Jesus is on his way to the cross to save people from their sin. That's where he's going. That's what he's doing. And to be in the procession of life is not only to be protected by Jesus from the last enemy, death, but it's also to call out to everyone else and say, hey, join this procession. This is where you want to be. This is how you can have life eternal. So, which procession are you in? Are you still living as if death is the final enemy? Are you still living in fear, anxiety, and your drivenness to succeed? Being in the procession with Jesus means that you don't have to fear that anymore. Okay? All right, let's pray. If I can have the band come up as well.